used to secretly fix elections.
Yes.
How do you know that to be the case?
Because in October of 2000, I wrote a prototype for President Congressman Tom Feeney at the company I worked for in Oviedo, Florida, that did just that.
It would rig an election?
It would flip the vote 51-49 to whoever you wanted it to go to and whichever race you wanted to win.
To whoever you wanted to win. On November 2nd, 2004, George Bush was not popular. He was in the middle of an unpopular war. I was watching the exit polls, and it looked very clear that John Kerry was going to win.
Reporting for duty.
And then all of a sudden, the numbers that were coming in did not match up with what was coming in from the exit polls, and it didn't make any sense. It just didn't make any sense. Late in the evening, 6 states that exit polls showed were going to Kerry suddenly veered off to Bush. Ohio then became the tipping point of the entire national election. One guy who was reporting on the ground in Ohio from day one was attorney Bob Fitrakis of the Columbus Free Press. Bob Fitrakis and Cliff Arnebeck became the legal team suing for a recount in Ohio, taking on Ohio's Secretary of State J. Kenneth Blackwell, who also happened to be co-chair for the Bush-Cheney campaign in Ohio.
But let me just remind you of a few of the facts. Ken Blackwell called it a model election, but we're trying to figure out, was he talking Mussolini's first coup? There were tens of thousands of acts of irregularity.
In a single precinct in Ohio, a total of 638 ballots were cast on Election Day. Bush received over 4,000 of them.
24.93% of all the voters in Cleveland were purged, a city that went 83% for Kerry. 7,000 voters lost their right to vote in the inner city of Toledo because the Diebold OptiScan machines froze up.
Warren County is the last county in Ohio to come in with their vote totals, and they locked down the place where they're counting the votes, and they won't allow any witnesses in, won't allow any media in, and they say it's because of a Homeland Security threat, and yet the next day we check with Homeland Security, and they say we never spoke to anyone in Ohio. Bob Fitrakis reported a troubling aspect about Ohio's 2004 election night results. The function of the Secretary of State's computer servers to report election results was moved during the night of the election from Ohio to servers in Chattanooga, Tennessee. They were owned by Smart Tech. Fitrakis reports that Smart Tech hosts a number of GOP websites, including the Republican National Committee and even Karl Rove's infamous White House email accounts, 4 years of which have gone completely missing.
The mythical surge in Delaware County. In one precinct, the last 359 voters voted for George Bush. And they said, well, maybe a church bus showed up. Well, not everyone lives at the same address unless you're a follower of David Koresh.
The Green Party and the Libertarian Party turned out to be huge heroes because they stepped up and said, we want to recount in Ohio.
You guys, we're presidential candidates. You can say, we want to recount. Well, you only got 7 votes in Ohio. Don't care. We want to recount.
Maybe I got 10.
That's right.
That's what I want to know.
John Kerry didn't fight.
Where was he?
Hiding out, being low-key. I mean, one of his attorneys told me, well, he wants to remain viable in 2008.
Instead of remaining viable in 2004, when he
Which
actually
he should
might
have
have won if there was an investigation.
Congressman Conyers went to Ohio to make his report on what had gone wrong in the '04 presidential election. He's one of the most respected men in Congress. He's the Democratic leader of the Judiciary Committee. And they did a great job. What happened in Ohio simply was corruption on a very great scale involving a Mr. Blackwell, Secretary of State of Ohio. And the report was very well done, very legalistic in the best sense, constitutional. I wrote a preface to it. The New York Times refused to review it. The Washington Post did not review it. The Wall Street Journal, well. And of the major papers, only the Boston Globe looked at it, and then they didn't do much about it.
If you saw that George W. Bush, in fact, did not win Ohio, and that John Kerry actually won Ohio, how would you feel about that?
I would feel sick.
Does anybody here think that John Kerry should become the president? You're in favor of George Bush being president, even if the other guy got the most votes?
I don't think he did, but yes. If that were the case, yeah.
Wow, that's not very American, sir.
But I have yet to see any proof that anything was counted incorrectly.
I initially started my blog because the corporate mainstream media, frankly, was not doing their job. I was seeing things that needed to be reported and talked about. I talked about them, and people started to take notice, including the mainstream media, Washington Post and so forth, who would link to me and report on what I was reporting, but wouldn't do it themselves, and still are not doing it themselves.
Will there be a realistic investigation of the 2004 election? Because at this point, the votes in Ohio have not been counted, not even once.
The same kind of crass effort to stop the black vote that was exposed in Florida, I know for a fact took place in Georgia and probably all across the South.
I'm in Tennessee to attend a national conference on election fraud. A man named Bernie Ellis organized the conference called Gathering to Save Our Democracy.
Clint Curtis is the whistleblower from Florida.
Yeah.
So he's going to show how you can hack into a system.
If you have no vote, you have no civil rights.
I first came in touch with Clint Curtis after I had reported on a group named Justice Through Music that was putting on a reward of $200,000 for evidence of fraud in the 2004 election. Clint was one of the folks, apparently, who had contacted them with his story, with his information, and he said, in I believe that very first email to them, that he didn't want the reward, but he wanted them to know his story.
In 2000, I was working for Yang Enterprises, which was a company in Oviedo, Florida, and their chief lobbyist, their corporate attorney, and Speaker of the House of Florida was Tom Feeney. And he was there to feed his contracts. So he came in one day, one of my first introductions to him, and he wanted us to build a vote-flipping software.
He's the Speaker of the Florida House, or about to be.
Right.
He comes into Yang, where you're working.
He came in and he wanted a vote fraud system to be built.
He wanted a vote fraud system to be built?
He wanted a program that could flip the votes without anyone seeing it. He wanted it to be able to be run on a touchscreen machine.
Okay.
In other words, hidden buttons on the screen or something like that. No keyboards, no guy in a black mask sitting across the street in a van poking things in. You know, just walk up and do something. And he wanted the source code to be written in such a way that the manipulation was hidden even if you saw the source code.
Is that possible?
It's not possible. If it's there and someone takes the time to look, you can't hide it. So I told him right up front that as long as you can see the source code, you can't hide it. Cannot hide it, can't be done.
And what did he say?
Well, Mrs. Yang cut me off and said...
Who's Mrs. Yang?
Mrs. Yang is the head of the company.
All right.
And she cut me off and said, we'll build it for you. Give you something to show.
Did you understand that he was asking you to do something that was illegal?
I was a Republican. I thought Tom Feeney thought the Democrats had something planned.
Okay.
And he was trying to prevent it. So I built it, delivered it the next day to her. I had a little document all written up on, how, in order to make sure that, fraud was found, what elements you would need.
Right.
And she cuts me off and says, you don't understand. In order to get the contract, we need to hide the code. This is for flipping the vote in South Florida.
This is the same Tom Feeney who, as Speaker of the House in 2000, claimed that no matter what, the Supreme Court said he was going to give the electors to George W. Bush.
Yes, that's the guy.
The same Tom Feeney, as I understand it, who was Jeb Bush's running mate for governor back in '94, when Jeb lost, by the way.
Yes.
So Feeney did him no good.
Did him no good that time.
That time.
There you
You're
go.
right.
And so Feeney was basically feeding us contracts and saying, you know, can we do this? Can we do that? You know.
Okay.
I was kind of the technology supervisor. If we could do it, then I would tell them, and we could run whatever, you know, little test pattern they wanted for us.
Jeb was already governor at that point?
Yes.
2000? Okay.
Jeb was already governor.
When I was contacted by Clint, I said, well, would you be willing to put this into an affidavit, a sworn affidavit? Since a lot of this stuff off the bat is still difficult to prove, especially that nugget of that meeting with Tom Feeney and the vote rigging software is still largely a he said story.
On December 6, 2004, Clint Curtis filed an affidavit with Congress alleging that one of their members, Tom Feeney of Florida, had asked him to create vote rigging software.
He asked you to design a code to rig an election.
Yes.
While he was Speaker of the Florida House.
Yes. When we filed the affidavit in December, the dog turned up shot the very day we filed that. So I don't know if it's a threat or more of just we can do whatever we want whenever we want it kind of a statement.
The day that I broke the story, Clint Curtis's affidavit, I had been awake for 3 days straight. I was so creeped out by this entire thing that I couldn't sleep. The same day that I broke that story, I got a phone call from Clint in D.C. saying that his dog had been shot. And I thought, oh man, he's, you know, Clint's gonna, with this kind of crap happening, he's not gonna want to continue, you know, telling this story. He said to me, no, you're damn right, we're gonna keep reporting this story, and we're gonna keep, you know, I'm still gonna continue talking about what I've learned.
Yang's attorney quickly released a statement claiming that Mr. Curtis's allegations are categorically false and that Clint Curtis is a disgruntled former employee.
I have heard, Clint, that you were a disgruntled employee of Yang, and that's why you've been making these claims.
That was their original excuse until I produced, and I think it's on your blog, isn't it? This card, which they gave me, which said, you know, come back anytime, the door will always be open.
This is what Yang said to you.
Well, the actual owner, Mrs. Yang, wrote that.
I'm wondering if Mrs. Yang is available. This is Brad Friedman calling. Any idea when she might be available? I'm working on a story on deadline. Is there a spokesperson for the company that might be able to answer some questions? Hello?
This meeting with Tom Feeney, where he asked you to create what is essentially vote rigging software for electronic voting machines. Tom Feeney is in the room. You're in the room. Mrs. Yang, the CEO, is in the room. Anybody else in the room?
Mike Cohen.
Who is Mike Cohen?
Mike Cohen was the executive secretary for Mrs. Yang. He was basically the note taker.
Mike Cohen, the executive secretary for Mrs. Yang, whom Curtis claimed was at the vote rigging meeting, told a reporter from Wired that the meeting never took place.
And I called him and I said, hi, this is Brad Friedman. Brad, yes, Mike Cohen, I wanted to ask you a couple. Brad, I don't want to be impolite. I'm going to hang up the phone, but I don't want to. But Mike, I'm wondering, can you, Brad! And he just would not let me get out a word. And then he hung up. And I guess he doesn't want to speak to me.
If they really tried to put out a program to do vote fraud, the minute they checked the source code, they'd see it.
It sounds like you presumed that these counties, these states, and so forth would examine the source code before it was actually used in an election, correct?
Well, yeah.
But they do not, correct?
That's what I've heard.
What did you think when you heard that?
That I should tell people what's going on. What he wanted was a program that would flip the vote. And this is what I produced, basically. It looks like that.
You've compiled essentially a prototype program to show how somebody could, in fact, if they wanted to, use the touchscreen software to flip the vote.
Correct.
Is this the actual program that you built for them?
No.
So you don't have the actual software that you wrote for them?
No, I just rewrote a duplicate of it because it's real simple. It's like 100 lines of code. This is a little garbage program that I wrote for Feeney. You don't see the actual vote count. So you walk up. Who do you want to vote for here? Kerry is winning. A little bit. Okay? You come in, you vote for Bush, you vote for Bush, you vote for Bush. Always adds by one. Vote for Kerry, vote for Kerry. So the people that are going to be validating this machine can stand there all day long and vote for somebody, and it will be right every time. Pretty simple, okay? But the guy could walk up here, and if he hits the right buttons, he can flip the vote that easy. So the whole vote total has changed. You could have 20 people standing behind his back while he's poking at a screen, and you never saw it.
What's the percentage that you worked out for
51-49.
51 to 49.
Because it's under the recall. Close enough, you don't have a recall. When I actually wrote it, it wasn't Bush-Kerry, it was cat and dog, I think, or something like that.
I think the voting should still be done on paper because it's way too easy to manipulate computers.
Jesse Jackson and I were on a speakerphone with Mr. Kerry, and we told him, Mr. Kerry didn't really respond to what we said about Ohio, but he did point out that the OptiScans and wherever they used them in New Mexico, he lost regardless of the Democratic and Republican registration. He said, it sure seems like I lost everywhere they used those machines.
Why didn't you leave the building with a copy of the source code to prove what had gone on?
Because it's a secured site. You don't do that. We have government contracts, and nothing is supposed to leave the building.
It is more difficult to get into the Yang offices than it is to get into a government office.
Really?
Yes. I was an employee of the Department of Transportation.
Florida Department of
The
Transportation.
Florida Department of Transportation. The department entered into a contract with Yang, I believe, in January of '99. I had known Mrs. Yang since approximately '94, '95.
Did she ever tell you how she came to hire Tom Feeney?
She indicated to me that now that he was in politics, that they had hired Mr. Feeney as their general counsel.
Did that strike you as odd that a company doing business with the state would hire the incoming Speaker of the House?
It struck me as odd that an individual like this, in addition to being general counsel for a vendor, would also be the registered paid lobbyist for a vendor. And Mr. Feeney was both for Yang Enterprises. His political campaign offices were in the same building where she had her offices and a building in which she owned. Something was slowly going wrong. The invoices from Yang began to escalate every time I would reject an invoice and say, no, this is not what we agreed to. Here was your authorization, that's all you can bill. We'll have to discuss this with our general counsel, Mr. Tom Feeney. He's the Speaker of the House. So they began using his name, trying to intimidate me.
Did you have enough of a concern about it to go to anybody and say, hey, this doesn't seem right?
Since he was Speaker of the House and a member of the House, I'll call the House Ethics Committee and said that, you know, I was having a problem and there may well be political influence, and how did they handle these things? And they told me that Mr. Feeney was the person who would review it and either accept it for review or throw it out as being not worthwhile.
Wait a minute.
And I said, I'm complaining about Mr. Feeney. And they said, we don't have any way to bypass him. The way our committee is set up, Mr. Feeney is the one who will evaluate your complaint. For one of our elected politicians to use the power of his office for self, that's not supposed to happen.
Prior to getting introduced to Feeney,
right,
they just seemed odd. Things were odd. You know, they had people sneaking up the back stairs, and they were downloading information from NASA that didn't seem like they should be doing that. You know, things like this.
They had a NASA contract, correct?
Yes.
And they have to have sort of top secret clearance to have this contract?
I would assume they must have some clearance, because, you know.
Did Feeney help them get that contract?
Don't know, but he has connections to NASA. His wife works there.
So you don't know if Feeney was instrumental in helping them get that particular contract. Okay, you said that they were downloading stuff from NASA software?
Yang Enterprises was bringing gigabytes of databases from NASA, and then they were handing it over to Henry Nee.
Who is Henry Nee?
Henry Nee was a little skinny Chinese guy that worked there, and he wasn't legal.
He was an illegal alien?
Mm-hmm.
Even while I was looking into the story, we then discovered the matter of Henry Nee.
They finally arrested him for sending missile chips to China.
Henry Nee was in fact arrested after a 4-year sting last year on 3 counts of attempting to send Hellfire anti-tank missile chips to China.
And he admitted to doing it 20 times.
And he pled guilty to one of the charges and admitted it was a slow year, so they only did this 10 to 20 times. And when he was sentenced in October of 2004, he was sentenced to 3 years probation and a $100 fine.
Pretty weak, huh? He seems to think he's pretty much promised a green card as soon as he's done with his probation.
To this day, Mrs. Yang, I understand, says that Henry Nee never worked at Yang Enterprises, Inc.
It's one of the reasons you can prove that he was working on the project was the fact that they actually billed for him.
They're sending timesheets to you saying, here's who worked on what and how many hours they worked and so forth.
Correct.
One of them was Clint Curtis.
One of them was Clint Curtis.
One of them was Henry Nee.
One of them was Henry Nee.
She was regularly shipping information off to her brother in China.
She, Mrs. Yang,
Mrs.
the
Yang.
CEO. Okay.
Right.
Who was her brother in China?
Her brother, according to her, she got drunk one time and she was happy, and she was telling me about her brother had been thrown out of the country for spying. Of course, she said he didn't do it, but he'd been tossed for spying, and then she's doing all this correspondence. She said it was video games, and I asked her, should you really be shipping all this stuff to your brother, since we have NASA contracts, and the government thinks he's a spy? If you got every environmental group, every group you have, just say, we're not going to do anything else. We're going to make the vote system, and we're going to fix it. And you could fix it in 2 months. But you've got to abandon everything else for those months and not save the whales and not do anything else, but fix that problem. Because if you don't fix that problem, nothing else you want to do will matter.
Thank you. I am pleased to follow that liar, Clint Curtis. In case anybody missed it this morning, Clint Curtis passed a lie detector test, and it ran in this morning's St. Petersburg Times.
Did you have any concerns about taking the polygraph test?
No. I've been trying to for quite a while, but the opportunity came along for someone who is supposedly, top of the line.
Right.
Big career with Florida Department of Law Enforcement, so it's a good time to do it.
What'd they ask?